Chapter 1: Mesoamerica, Time, Sacrifice, and the Gods of Collapse. Mesoamerica did not fear the end of the world. It expected it. While many civilizations sought permanence through empire law or memory, the peoples of Mesoamerica built their entire worldview on a more unsettling assumption. The universe is unstable, and survival depends on constant renewal through sacrifice. Time was not a line. It was a cycle that devoured itself. Long before the rise of the Maya city-states or the Aztec Empire, the land that would become Mesoamerica was already shaped by this belief. Dense jungles, volatile volcanoes, shifting climates, and fragile agricultural rhythms taught an unforgiving lesson. Existence was provisional. Nothing lasted unless it was paid for. In Mesoamerican cosmology, the gods themselves were not eternal creators standing above the world. They were participants in it, beings who had already died once to create the present age. The sun rose not because it must, but because it was fed. Human life was not sacred in the modern sense. It was necessary. This worldview produced one of the most complex relationships between power, religion, and violence in human history. For the Maya, time was mathematics made sacred. Their calendars measured not just days, but cosmic epochs. Dates were carved into stone, not to record history, but to anchor the present within vast temporal cycles stretching backward and forward thousands of years. To exist was to occupy a moment already foretold. Kings did not rule because they were strong. They ruled because they stood at the intersection of cosmic time and ritual obligation. Their blood literally kept the world aligned. Royal bloodletting was not symbolic, it was functional. The ruler's body was a bridge. The Aztecs would later radicalize this logic. Where the Maya sought balance, the Aztecs embraced urgency. Their myths told of previous suns that had already collapsed worlds, destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. The current sun, they believed, was fragile. If it stopped moving, everything ended. Thus, sacrifice was not cruelty, it was maintenance. The Aztec state became a machine designed to extract human offerings at scale. War was redefined. Battles were fought not to annihilate enemies, but to capture them alive. The purpose of empire was not territory, it was ritual supply. Power was measured not by land controlled, but by blood offered. This created a political structure unlike anything seen in Eurasia. Law existed, but it served ritual. Administration existed, but it served cosmology. Violence was not chaotic, it was scheduled. Calendars dictated when wars occurred. Priests calculated when sacrifices were required. Cities aligned their architecture to celestial events. The entire civilization was synchronized to the gods' appetite, and yet this system worked. For centuries, Mesoamerican civilizations built monumental cities, developed advanced astronomy, sophisticated agriculture, and complex trade networks. Without metal tools, without beasts of burden, without wheeled transport, they constructed pyramids that still defy explanation. They were not primitive. They were precise, but precision does not equal resilience. The same worldview that sustained Mesoamerica also trapped it. Because collapse was expected, it was also normalized. There was no concept of linear progress to defend, no belief that tomorrow must be better than today. When droughts came, when crops failed, when omens darkened, the response was not reform but more sacrifice. The system could intensify, but it could not transform. Here lay the fatal paradox. Mesoamerican civilization placed meaning above human life, but eventually consumed the very people required to sustain it. Power depended on terror and awe, but terror breeds rebellion, and awe decays into fear. By the time the Spanish arrived, they did not encounter a unified civilization. They encountered overextended ritual states, locked into cycles they could no longer control. Internal enemies were plentiful. Legitimacy was strained. The gods demanded more, but society had less to give. The arrival of Europeans did not create collapse. It interrupted a civilization already living on borrowed time. Steel, horses, disease, and alliances finished what cosmology had prepared. The gods did not save their people, not because they were false, but because the system required endless payment in a world suddenly transformed. Mesoamerica fell not because it misunderstood power, but because it understood it to absolutely. It believed the universe demanded blood, and when the universe changed its terms, there was no alternative logic left. Yet to call this civilization a failure is to miss its lesson. Mesoamerica teaches that meaning can be built on terror and still inspire greatness. That societies can function brilliantly while standing on the edge of collapse. That time itself can become a god and a prison. It reminds us that civilizations do not fall only from weakness. They fall when their deepest truths can no longer adapt. Chapter 2: Mesoamerica, the Maya Mind, Mathematics, Kingship, and Sacred Time. To understand the Maya, one must first abandon the modern assumption that time exists to be measured for human convenience. For the Maya, humans existed to serve time. Time was not abstract. It was alive, structured, hierarchical, and dangerous if mishandled. The Maya did not merely track days. They decoded reality through numbers. At the heart of Maya civilization lay a mathematical worldview so advanced that it emerged independently of Eurasian influence. The Maya developed a base 20 numerical system, employed positional notation, and most remarkably used a true concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. 0 was not emptiness, it was potential. This mathematical sophistication was not pursued for commerce or engineering alone. It was sacred. Numbers were cosmological forces, each carrying spiritual weight. Arithmetic was theology expressed through calculation. Time itself was structured into multiple overlapping calendars, each serving a different metaphysical purpose. The Tisocan, a 260-day ritual calendar, governed divination and religious ceremonies. The Hab, a 365-day solar calendar, regulated agriculture and civic life. But above them both stood the long count, a system designed to measure vast epochs spanning thousands of years. The long count did not exist to predict the future. It existed to locate the present within an immense cosmic cycle. Every event, birth, coronation, war, death, was meaningful only in relation to its temporal position. A king born on an auspicious date was not lucky, he was destined. A defeat occurring on an inauspicious day was not a failure of strategy. It was a cosmic correction. Free will existed, but only within the boundaries set by time. This belief reshaped kingship itself. Maya rulers were not gods, but they were not merely men. They were time-bearers, living conduits between the human world and the supernatural order. Their legitimacy rested not on conquest or heredity alone, but on their ability to perform rituals that aligned the city with cosmic cycles. A king who failed to keep time properly endangered everyone. Thus, Royal authority was inseparable from ritual performance. Coronations were timed to celestial events. Steely tall, stone monuments recorded not personal achievements, but dates, accessions, anniversaries, ritual completions. The ruler's body became a site of cosmic maintenance. Bloodletting rituals were central to this process. Maya elites pierced their tongues, ears, and genitals, offering blood to the gods. The pain was deliberate. Blood was believed to open portals to the spirit world, allowing ancestors and deities to communicate. Suffering created order. Unlike later Aztec mass sacrifice, Maya ritual violence was intimate and controlled. It reinforced hierarchy while preserving balance. The goal was not terror, but synchronization. Cities themselves reflected this philosophy. Maya urban centers were not chaotic agglomerations, but carefully planned ritual landscapes. Temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Pyramids mirrored sacred mountains. Causeways connected ceremonial spaces according to cosmological logic rather than efficiency. The city was a calendar made of stone. Yet for all their intellectual rigor, the Maya political system was fragile. There was no unified Maya empire. Instead, dozens of city-states, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, competed for prestige, ritual dominance, and dynastic legitimacy. Warfare existed, but it was episodic and symbolic rather than total. Victory mattered less than timing. A captured noble was more valuable than a slain enemy. His blood, lineage, and ritual worth could recalibrate cosmic balance. War was another form of ritual performance. This system produced extraordinary cultural achievements, art, astronomy, architecture, but it also limited adaptability. Because authority flowed from sacred time, innovation was dangerous. To change rituals too much was to risk cosmic disorder. When environmental stress increased prolonged droughts, soil exhaustion, population pressure, the Maya response remained ritual rather than structural. Kings intensified ceremonies, monuments multiplied, blood flowed more freely. But time cannot be bribed forever. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, many major Maya cities were abandoned. Steely inscriptions ceased. Dynasties collapsed. The jungle reclaimed temples with terrifying speed. This was not sudden annihilation. It was ritual exhaustion. The Maya did not lose their knowledge. They lost the capacity to sustain the political religious machinery that gave it meaning. Without kings to keep time, cities unraveled. Without ritual authority, hierarchy dissolved. And yet, the Maya did not vanish. Their descendants survived, adapted, and endured, carrying fragments of ancient cosmology into a transformed world. The collapse was not civilizational extinction, but the end of a specific relationship between power, mathematics, and sacred time. The Maya remind us that intelligence does not guarantee survival. Precision does not equal flexibility. A civilization can master time and still be defeated by it. They measured eternity with extraordinary accuracy. They simply could not escape its weight. If the Maya mind was shaped by time, Maya power was shaped by space, not open plains or navigable rivers, but dense jungle, broken highlands, and fragile ecological corridors. It produced cities. Power in Mesoamerica was nodal, not territorial. A Maya city did not control land in the modern sense. It controlled people, roots, calendars, and prestige. Authority weakened rapidly beyond ceremonial cores. There were no fixed borders, only gradients of influence, allegiance, and fear. The jungle itself enforced fragmentation. Unlike the river civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica lacked natural highways. Rivers were seasonal and unreliable. Transport depended on footpaths, causeways, and human labor. There were no pack animals, no wheeled vehicles for freight, and no metal tools to carve rapid expansion. What emerged instead was a dense constellation of city-states, each fiercely autonomous, bound together by trade and ritual competition rather than centralized command. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, and Yaxchilan were not capitals of an empire. They were performative centers. Their greatness was measured by monuments raised, rituals completed, and alliances displayed in stone inscriptions. At the city's heart stood plazas framed by pyramids and palaces. These were not spaces for crowds alone, but for spectacle processions, blood rituals, captive displays. Architecture communicated power vertically. The higher the structure, the closer to the gods. Surrounding ceremonial cores were residential compounds, workshops, and agricultural terraces, carefully integrated into the environment. Maya urbanism blurred the line between city and countryside. Fields, reservoirs, and temples coexisted in a managed ecological system that required constant maintenance. This balance was fragile. Trade networks were the arteries of Mesoamerican power. Luxury goods conferred legitimacy. A ruler who could acquire jade masks or quetzal feathers demonstrated not wealth alone, but access to cosmic favor and diplomatic reach. Yet trade did not unify Mesoamerica into a single system. It intensified rivalry. Cities competed for control over routes, resources, and marriage alliances. Diplomatic ties were sealed through dynastic marriages, only to collapse generations later into ritualized warfare. Alliances were temporary. Betrayal was expected. Conflict followed patterns distinct from total war. Battles were often staged encounters aimed at capturing nobles rather than annihilating populations. But beneath this ritualized violence lay real instability. For centuries, these two great cities anchored opposing alliance networks across the Maya lowlands. Wars between these hegemonic centers reshaped regional politics without ever producing lasting unification. This fragmentation extended beyond the Maya heartland. Maya rulers adopted Teotihuacan imagery to legitimize their own power. Yet even Teotihuacan ruled more through ideology than occupation. Environmental constraints magnified this instability. Mesoamerican agriculture relied heavily on maize, beans, and squash, nutritionally complementary but ecologically demanding /sandburn farming required fallow periods. Terracing and water management could extend productivity, but only with constant labor. Soil degraded, reservoirs silted, droughts periodic but devastating exposed the limits of ritual responses. Trade networks frayed, rival cities competed more aggressively for shrinking resources. Each polity sought to preserve its autonomy through intensified ritual display rather than structural reform. Cities of stone became liabilities. Abandoned plazas, unfinished pyramids, and eroded causeways marked not sudden catastrophe, but gradual withdrawal. Elites lost followers, trade routes shifted, power diffused back into the countryside. People adapted by dispersing. Smaller communities survived where great cities failed. Knowledge of agriculture, cosmology, and craft persisted beyond the fall of urban centers. Mesoamerica did not end, it reconfigured. This pattern brilliant urban nodes, rising, competing, and dissolving would repeat across centuries. It shaped the conditions under which later civilizations, including the Aztecs, would emerge. From jungle cities to lake capitals, Mesoamerican power remained fragmented, symbolic, and intensely local. Stone could command, all jungle could reclaim it. And in this tension between monument and environment, Mesoamerica forged a civilization defined not by unity, but by resilient plurality, a world where power was always provisional and collapse was never total. Chapter 4: Mesoamerica, the Aztec world, war, tribute, and the architecture of fear, where the Maya fragmented into cities of time and ritual. The Aztecs built something different, predatory empire designed to extract, intimidate, and endure through violence. The Aztec world was not born ancient, it was born hungry. The Mexica people arrived late to the basin of Mexico, outsiders without land, lineage, or prestige. Older city-states despised them. Legends describe them as wanderers, mercenaries, and scavengers useful in war, unwelcome in peace. What they lacked in legitimacy, they compensated for with discipline, adaptability, and terror. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was founded on a marshy island in Lake Texcoco, an unlikely site that became a strategic masterpiece. Surrounded by water, linked by causeways, supplied by Chinampa agriculture, the city was both fortress and machine. From the beginning, Aztec power was engineered. Chinampa's artificial agricultural islands turned wetlands into one of the most productive farming systems in the pre-modern world. They fed dense populations and standing armies. Food security was not incidental. It was militarized. War followed. Unlike Maya ritual conflict, Aztec warfare was systemic, and expansionist. Conquest was not symbolic, it was economic. Every defeated city was folded into a tributary network that fed the capital with maize, cacao, cotton, obsidian, jade, rubber, feathers, and human beings. The empire did not rule directly, it ruled through extraction. Local elites remained in place so long as tribute flowed. Resistance was punished publicly and relentlessly. Entire cities could be annihilated as warnings to others. Fear was not a byproduct of rule, it was infrastructure. The Aztec state was built as a tribute engine. At its core stood the triple allianced Texcoco and Tlacopan, but dominance was unequal. Tenochtitlan absorbed the lion's share of tribute and power, transforming allies into satellites. This imbalance was deliberate. By keeping rivals dependent and resentful, the Aztecs ensured constant tension that justified further warfare. Expansion did not stabilize the empire, it sustained it. War was perpetual because it had to be. But Aztec violence was not merely political, it was cosmic. Aztec cosmology imagined the universe as fragile and starving. The sun required nourishment to rise. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Humanity was obligated to repay that debt in blood. Human sacrifice was not cruelty in Aztec logic, it was maintenance. Captured warriors were the most valuable offering. Their deaths reaffirmed cosmic order, validated military success, and terrified subject populations. Ritual killing was staged atop pyramids. Before mass audiences, violence made visible, sacred, and unavoidable. The Templo Mayor, rising at the heart of Tenochtitlan, embodied this worldview. Dual shrines honored Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Blood fed the sun, water fed the crops. Survival required both. Architecture reinforced ideology. Wide plazas enabled mass spectacle. Steep pyramids dramatized ascent and sacrifice. Causeways controlled movement. The city itself instructed inhabitants and visitors alike. This was a place where gods were fed, and power was unquestionable. Aztec society mirrored this structure. At the top stood the Huey-Tlatoani, the great speaker, both military commander and sacred intermediary. His authority derived not from divine birth alone, but from successful warfare. Failure in war was failure in rule. Below him, a rigid hierarchy organized society into nobles, commoners, merchants, artisans, and slaves. Yet mobility existed through war. A commoner who captured enemies could rise in status. Nobility was reinforced through violence, not insulated from it. The battlefield was the primary avenue of advancement. Children were trained accordingly. Education was universal and militarized. Boys learned endurance, obedience, and combat. Girls were trained for domestic labor that sustained the war economy. Discipline was severe. Pain was instructional. The Aztec state produced citizens of sacrifice. Trade complemented conquest. Merchant guilds, the Pochteca, traveled far beyond imperial borders, functioning as spies as much as traders. They gathered intelligence, scouted targets, and softened regions for eventual conquest. Economy and espionage merged. Markets, especially the vast market of Tlatelolco, were meticulously regulated. Judges enforced contracts. Currency included cacao beans and cloth. The Aztecs were not economically primitive. They were administratively sophisticated, yet the system contained fatal contradictions. Because the empire relied on continuous conquest, it created enemies faster than it could assimilate them. Subject cities paid tribute, but they did not become Aztecs. They waited. Resentment accumulated. The infamous Flower Wars staged conflicts designed to capture sacrificial victims rather than territory, exemplified this tension. While ideologically coherent, they signaled strategic stagnation. War became ritualized even as geopolitical threats multiplied. The empire expanded wide but shallow. No unified legal code bound subject peoples. No shared identity replaced local loyalties. Tribute flowed upward, trust did not. When droughts struck or tribute demands intensified, rebellion simmered. The Aztecs responded with greater brutality, reinforcing fear. But fear alone cannot sustain loyalty indefinitely. The empire's greatest strength, its militarized cosmology, became its greatest vulnerability. When foreign invaders arrived centuries later, bearing unfamiliar weapons and exploiting internal resentments, many subject cities chose alliance over obedience. They did not see the Aztecs as protectors of cosmic order, but as predators. The Aztec world collapsed quickly, not because it was weak, but because it was isolated at its core. Yet collapse did not erase meaning. The Aztec synthesis of war, economy, religion, and architecture represented one of the most internally coherent systems ever constructed in the pre-modern world. It was ruthless, rational within its own logic, and astonishingly effective until conditions changed. In the Aztec vision, the universe survived only through sacrifice. Ironically, the empire itself would become one. The next chapter confronts that rupture when gods fell silent. Steel crossed the sea, and Mesoamerica's worlds collided with an alien order. Chapter 5: Mesoamerica, Conquest, Catastrophe, and the End of the Fifth Sun. The Aztec world did not imagine an end, it imagined cycles. According to Mexica cosmology, the universe had already been created and destroyed 4 times. Each sun had ended in catastrophe, flood, fire, jaguars, wind. Humanity survived only because the gods sacrificed themselves again and again. The Aztecs believed they lived under the 5th sun, fragile, unstable, and hungry. If the gods were not fed, the sun would stop moving, and the world would collapse into darkness. When the strangers arrived from the east in 1519, many Aztecs did not see an apocalypse. They saw confirmation. The arrival of Hernan Cortes and his small expedition force coincided with ominous signs recorded in later chronicles: comets, temple fires, deformities, voices in the night. Whether these omens were real, retroactively constructed, or politically weaponized matters less than the effect they produced. They framed the conquest as cosmic inevitability. Cortes did not conquer Mesoamerica by force alone. He exploited fractures already embedded in the Aztec imperial system. Subject cities, Tlaxcala, foremost among them, had endured decades of tribute extraction, ritual humiliation, and forced sacrifice. To them, the Spaniards were not invaders at first. They were opportunity. Steel, horses, and gunpowder shocked the battlefield, but alliances decided its outcome. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors marched alongside a few hundred Europeans. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not a duel between civilizations, it was a civil war amplified by foreign technology. Yet even that explanation is incomplete. The true weapon of conquest was invisible. Disease preceded and followed the Spaniards like a silent god. Smallpox, measles, influenza pathogens to which Europeans had partial immunity tore through Mesoamerican populations with catastrophic speed. Entire communities collapsed before battles were fought. Mortality rates reached levels difficult to comprehend. In some regions, over half the population died within decades. Social memory shattered. Priests died. Elders died. Healers died. Administrative continuity disintegrated. Knowledge, systems oral, ritual, calendrical lost their carriers. The world did not merely fall, it forgot itself. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked a symbolic endpoint. The great island city, once the center of tribute, ritual, and spectacle, was starved, bombarded, and systematically dismantled. Canals were filled, temples destroyed, stones were reused to build a new colonial capital, Mexico City. Architecture was overwritten. Where the Templo Mayor had once fed the sun with blood, cathedrals rose to proclaim a different cosmic order. The gods of sacrifice were declared demons. The calendar was replaced. The language of power changed. But conquest did not simply replace one belief system with another. It produced epistemic rupture. The Spanish introduced Christianity as universal truth, yet ruled through coercion, forced labor, and racial hierarchy. Indigenous peoples were baptized, renamed, and reorganized into colonial categories: Indian, Mestizo, Spanish, that had never existed before. Identity became imposed. The encomienda system transformed tribute into labor extraction. Where the Aztec Empire had demanded goods and captives, the colonial regime demanded bodies mining, agriculture, construction. Work itself became a form of sacrifice, now justified not by cosmic renewal, but by imperial entitlement. Violence lost its ritual meaning, but not its presence. Indigenous cosmologies did not vanish. They fractured and adapted. Gods were hidden behind saints. Rituals migrated into festivals. Calendrical thinking survived in agricultural cycles and community memory. Syncretism became survival, yet something essential was lost. The Mesoamerican worldview had been coherent. Brutal, yes, but internally rational. Humans, gods, nature, and time were bound into a single system of obligation. After conquest, that coherence dissolved. Christianity promised salvation, but not reciprocity. Colonial rule imposed order, but not belonging. The fifth sun did not end in fire or flood. It ended in meaning collapse. By the late 16th century, Mesoamerica was unrecognizable. Population levels had plummeted. Cities lay abandoned. Knowledge systems were fragmented or deliberately erased. Codices were burned. Lineages dissolved. The world survived, but it no longer understood why. Yet even catastrophe did not produce total erasure. Mesoamerican concepts of cyclical time resurfaced in resistance movements, millenarian uprisings, and later nationalist myth-making. The memory of lost worlds persisted beneath colonial narratives. The gods were declared dead. They were not forgotten. The conquest revealed a deeper truth about civilizations. Collapse is rarely total, and survival is rarely pure. What emerges afterward is hybrids, adaptive, unresolved. Mesoamerica did not disappear. It was recomposed under domination. The end of the fifth sun was not the end of history. It was the end of autonomy, the moment when indigenous futures were constrained within imperial frameworks, not of their choosing. And yet, even within those constraints, meaning continued to evolve. The next chapter moves beyond collapse to examine what endured, how memory, resistance, and reinterpretation carried Mesoamerican thought forward into colonial and modern eras. Chapter 6: Mesoamerica, Survival, Syncretism, and the Long Memory of Ruin, Collapse did not end Mesoamerica. It repositioned it. After conquest, the world that emerged was not a clean replacement of one civilization by another, but a layered reality in which indigenous memory survived beneath colonial power. What had been shattered cities, dynasties, priesthoods left behind fragments that refused to disappear. The ruins did not speak, but people remembered how to listen. Spanish colonial rule sought order through categorization. Indigenous peoples were renamed, regrouped, and governed as abstract populations. Yet beneath these imposed structures, older systems of meaning adapted quietly. Survival required transformation, not confrontation. This was the logic of syncretism. Christian saints absorbed indigenous gods. The Virgin of Guadalupe emerged not merely as a Catholic icon, but as a reconfiguration of earlier earth and mother deities. Ritual calendars were overlaid with Christian feasts, yet agricultural cycles, sacred days, and seasonal observances preserved pre-Columbian rhythms. The gods did not vanish. They learned new names. Language became the primary vessel of endurance. Nahuatl, Maya languages, Mixtec, Zapotec, these were not only means of communication, but archives of cosmology. Words encoded relationships between humans, land, time, and obligation that colonial rule could not fully erase. Even when written codices were burned, oral memory persisted. Colonial authorities underestimated this persistence because they mistook silence for submission. Public conformity masked private continuity. Communities attended Mass while performing older rites at home. They adopted Christian vocabulary while preserving indigenous logic. Faith became layered. Labor regimes, mines, plantations, workshops attempted to discipline bodies and extract value, but communal structures endured at the local level. The Kalpuli community units transformed rather than disappeared, organizing land use, mutual aid, and cultural transmission. Colonial power ruled from above. Memory ruled from within. The trauma of conquest remained central to indigenous consciousness. It was not remembered as a single event, but as an ongoing condition: loss of autonomy, land dispossession, cultural denigration. This long memory of ruin shaped responses to authority for centuries. Resistance took many forms. Some were overt: rebellions, uprisings, millenarian movements, predicting the return of old gods or the end of colonial time. Others were subtle: refusal to abandon language, quiet maintenance of ritual, selective obedience to imposed norms. Time itself became a site of resistance. Indigenous, temporal frameworks, cyclical, layered, recursive, clashed with the linear, progressive time of colonial administration. For colonial authorities, history moved forward toward salvation and civilization. For Mesoamerican communities, the past remained present. Ruin was not an endpoint. It was a condition of existence. This divergence produced profound misunderstandings. Spanish chroniclers often described indigenous peoples as living in a fallen state, childlike, backward, incomplete. They did not recognize that indigenous survival strategies were rational responses to domination. Adaptation was not weakness, it was intelligence under constraint. By the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial categories hardened into racial hierarchies that continued to marginalize indigenous populations even after independence. New nation-states inherited colonial structures while rebranding them as modern. Indigenous identity was redefined as folklore rather than foundation, yet the memory endured. Archaeology became a double-edged sword, a source of pride and a reminder of dispossession. The present was neglected. The long memory of ruin shaped modern Mesoamerican consciousness in complex ways. It produced resilience, but also fragmentation. It preserved depth, but limited power. It endured, but at the cost of autonomy, coherence, and self-determination. Yet endurance itself became a form of meaning. The long memory of ruin is not nostalgia. It is orientation. It shapes how time is understood, how suffering is contextualized, how hope is framed. It resists the finality of defeat by refusing to forget. Mesoamerica teaches us that collapse is not merely destruction, it is transformation under pressure. What survives is not purity, but adaptability infused with memory. The gods fell silent, but the people learned to speak around the silence. And in doing so, they carried fragments of an ancient cosmology into a world that tried and failed to erase it. Chapter 7: Mesoamerica, Modern Nations, Indigenous Memory, and the Politics of the Past. Modern nation-states did not emerge on empty land. They rose on buried civilizations. When colonial rule collapsed in the 19th century, the new republics of Mesoamerica, most notably Mexico and the states of Central America, faced a foundational dilemma: how to build modern political identities on territories whose deepest histories contradicted European models of nationhood. Independence ended empire. It did not end hierarchy. Creole elites inherited colonial structures while rejecting colonial authority. They spoke the language of liberty, citizenship, and progress, yet feared the living presence of indigenous peoples whose existence challenged their vision of a unified, modern nation. The solution was selective memory. Ancient Mesoamerica was embraced as mythic heritage. Living indigenous cultures were treated as obstacles to progress. The Aztecs, Maya, and other pre-Columbian civilizations were reimagined as glorious ancestors dead. Monumental, safely distant. Pyramids became national symbols. Calendars, glyphs, and gods were celebrated in museums, textbooks, and patriotic narratives. But the descendants of those civilizations were marginalized, assimilated, or ignored. The past was nationalized. The present was silenced. This contradiction shaped the politics of memory across Mesoamerica. Archaeology became a state project, uncovering ruins to construct national legitimacy. Teotihuacan was framed as a precursor to modern Mexico. The Maya were recast as a lost civilization rather than a living people. Time was split. Ancient equals noble, scientific, artistic, contemporary, indigenous equals backward, rural, folkloric. This temporal division justified exclusion. Indigenous communities were denied land rights, political representation, and economic opportunity under the banner of modernization. Assimilation policies sought to erase difference rather than negotiate coexistence. Progress demanded forgetting. Yet, indigenous memory did not disappear simply because the state ignored it. It adapted, again this time, within the framework of modern politics. Community identity persisted through land claims, language preservation, ritual continuity, and localized governance. The struggle shifted from survival to recognition. In the 20th century, revolutions and reform movements reopened the question of the past. The Mexican Revolution 1910 to 1920, for example, explicitly invoked indigenous symbolism while promising land reform and social justice. Figures like Emiliano Zapata drew legitimacy from communal land traditions rooted in pre-Columbian and colonial resistance. The past returned, but on contested terms. State-sponsored Indigenismo celebrated indigenous culture while maintaining centralized control. Murals depicted Aztec grandeur and peasant dignity, yet real political power remained concentrated elsewhere. Indigenous identity was aestheticized rather than empowered. Culture without autonomy. By the late 20th century, indigenous movements increasingly rejected symbolic inclusion and demanded structural change. Language, rights, territorial sovereignty, and political representation became central demands. The Zapatista uprising in 1994 made this tension globally visible. Its message was clear: we are not relics, we are contemporaries. Globalization intensified these conflicts. Tourism commodified ruins. Markets appropriated indigenous imagery. Meanwhile, extractive industries, mining, logging, agribusiness expanded into indigenous territories, threatening land-based identities that had endured for centuries. Modernity arrived again as invasion. Indigenous memory became a political resource. Oral histories, cosmologies, and ancestral claims were mobilized in legal battles and international forums. The past was no longer merely heritage, it was evidence. Time became a weapon. This politicization of memory produced internal tensions as well. Communities navigated the risk of freezing identity into static traditions for recognition, even as their cultures continued to evolve. Authenticity became externally defined, often by institutions far removed from lived reality. The danger shifted from erasure to containment. Still, the persistence of indigenous worldviews reshaped national consciousness. Concepts of cyclical time, communal land, reciprocal obligation, and human nature balance entered public discourse, challenging Western developmental models. Mesoamerica's ancient questions resurfaced in modern form. What does progress destroy? What does memory demand? Who decides which past counts? Modern nations discovered that they could not fully escape the civilizations beneath them. Ruins were not silent. They shaped tourism, identity, protest, and policy. The gods no longer demanded blood, but land, dignity, and recognition became new forms of sacrifice demanded by the state. The politics of the past remained unresolved. Mesoamerica's legacy in the modern world is not simply historical. It is active, contested, and unfinished. The struggle is no longer between gods and humans, but between memory and power. And memory, once again, refuses to disappear. Chapter 8. Mesoamerica. Time after collapse. What this civilization still teaches the world. Civilizations usually teach through triumph. Mesoamerica teaches through aftermath. What endures after collapse is not architecture, empire, or power, but a way of understanding time itself. Long after pyramids fell silent and empires dissolved, Mesoamerican concepts of time continued to operate quietly, stubbornly beneath layers of conquest, nationalism, and globalization. This is their most radical legacy. In Western modernity, time moves forward. It accumulates. It promises progress, growth, and eventual mastery. Collapse is framed as failure, a deviation from the expected trajectory. Mesoamerican time does not share this assumption. For the Maya and Aztecs, time was cyclical, layered, and morally charged. Creation and destruction were not opposites, but partners. Worlds ended before worlds would end again. Survival did not mean permanence, it meant alignment. This worldview did not disappear with conquest. It survived because it explained reality more honestly than linear progress ever could. Communities that endured epidemics, dispossession, forced labor, and cultural suppression did not experience history as advancement. They experienced it as rupture, repetition, and return. Cyclical time did not deny suffering. It contextualized it. Collapse was not meaningless. It was intelligible. Modern ecological crises echo this logic with disturbing clarity. Climate instability, biodiversity loss, and resource exhaustion expose the fragility of linear growth models. Mesoamerican cosmology never assumed infinite expansion. It assumed imbalance was inevitable and demanded ritual, restraint, and recalibration. The gods demanded accountability from humans. Nature was not passive. Today, this perspective reemerges in environmental movements that emphasize reciprocity rather than domination. Indigenous concepts of land stewardship challenge extractive economics. Sacred geography confronts commodified space. The past speaks not as nostalgia, but as warning. Mesoamerica also teaches that collapse is uneven. Empires fall, but people remain. Systems disintegrate, but memory reorganizes itself. Survival does not preserve everything. It preserves what can be carried. This is a hard lesson for modern societies, addicted to total preservation. The codices were burned. The cities were abandoned. The rituals were interrupted. Yet meaning persisted, fragmented, altered, but alive. Civilization was not a structure. It was a relationship between humans, time, and obligation. When that relationship breaks, collapse follows. Another lesson lies in power itself. Mesoamerican civilizations remind us that sophistication does not guarantee resilience. Advanced astronomy, mathematics, and architecture coexisted with political fragmentation and ritual rigidity. Knowledge became sacred and, therefore, difficult to adapt. Innovation threatened cosmic order. Modern institutions face a similar risk when ideology hardens into certainty. When systems prioritize continuity over responsiveness, collapse accelerates under stress. The Maya did not fail because they were ignorant. They failed because they were too precise to change quickly. Collapse, then, is not stupidity. it is rigidity under pressure. There is also a moral lesson embedded in sacrifice. Aztec ritual violence horrifies modern sensibilities, yet it forces an uncomfortable comparison. Every civilization demands sacrifice. The question is not whether sacrifice exists, but who pays the cost. Mesoamerican sacrifice was explicit, ritualized, and cosmological. Modern sacrifice is abstract, economic, and hidden, extracted from distant laborers, future generations, and invisible ecosystems. The gods no longer demand hearts, markets do. This comparison does not excuse the past. It interrogates the present. Finally, Mesoamerica teaches endurance without illusion. There is no promise of final redemption, no guaranteed ascent. Time does not bend toward justice. Meaning must be actively maintained, or it dissolves. Civilization is work without completion. In this sense, Mesoamerica is not a fallen world. It is a mirror. It reflects the costs of imbalance, the danger of forgetting limits, and the possibility of continuity without dominance. After collapse, time does not end. It changes its demands. The ruins stand not as monuments to failure, but as evidence that civilizations are temporary answers to permanent questions. How should humans live within time? How much power can be exercised without imbalance? What must be remembered when structures fall? Mesoamerica does not provide comfort, it provides clarity. And clarity, after collapse, may be the most valuable inheritance of all. Chapter 9. Mesoamerica, Collapse as Pattern. Why civilizations rise, break, and return. Collapse is usually treated as an exception. Mesoamerica understood it as a pattern. This distinction matters. Modern histories often describe civilizations as linear projects, foundations laid, institutions built, progress achieved, until something goes wrong. Collapse becomes an aberration caused by invasion, mismanagement, or moral failure. Mesoamerican thought did not share this illusion. For the peoples of ancient Mexico and Central America, worlds were not meant to last forever. They were provisional arrangements, temporary alignments between gods, humans, land, and time. When balance failed, collapse followed not as tragedy alone, but as consequence. The fifth sun would not be the last. This cosmology did not produce passivity, it produced vigilance. If collapse was inevitable, then meaning lay not in preventing it at all costs, but in understanding when and why it arrived and what might follow. From this perspective, civilizations rise when three forces align. First, ecological viability. Second, social coherence. Third, symbolic legitimacy. Mesoamerican civilizations mastered the first two with remarkable skill. Agricultural systems were adapted to diverse environments: chinampas, terraces, raised fields, urban centers, coordinated labor, trade, and ritual across complex landscapes. But it was the third force, symbolic legitimacy, that held everything together. Kings ruled because time authorized them. Cities mattered because the gods recognized them. Sacrifice sustained the cosmic contract. As long as these beliefs held, social strain could be absorbed. When they weakened, collapse accelerated rapidly. This explains a central paradox of Mesoamerican history. Why societies of extraordinary intelligence and organization could unravel so completely without external conquest. The Maya collapse was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by overcommitment to a sacred system that could not adapt fast enough to material stress. As drought intensified and population pressure increased, elites responded by intensifying ritual rather than restructuring power. The solution to imbalance was always more ceremony, more monuments, more blood. Eventually, the system exhausted itself. The Aztec case illustrates a different version of the same pattern. The empire expanded aggressively, extracting tribute and captives to sustain its cosmology. Success reinforced belief. Belief justified expansion. But expansion created enemies faster than it created loyalty. When the Spanish arrived, they did not defeat a unified civilization. They exploited a fractured system whose symbolic legitimacy had already begun to strain under its own weight. Collapse followed swiftly, not because the Aztecs were weak, but because their political theology required constant victory to remain credible. Once defeat occurred, meaning evaporated. This reveals a deeper pattern. Civilizations collapse not when they lose power, but when they lose explanatory coherence. When existing narratives can no longer justify suffering, hierarchy, or sacrifice, allegiance dissolves. People do not abandon systems because they are harsh. They abandon them because they stop making sense. Mesoamerica also teaches that collapse is rarely total. It is selective. Empires fall, cities empty, priesthoods dissolve, but languages persist. This is why civilizations can return, not as restorations, but as recombinations. Post-conquest, Mesoamerica did not resurrect Aztec or Maya empires, but it reactivated older logics within new frameworks. Communal landholding, ritual calendars, sacred geography, and cyclical interpretations of history resurfaced again and again under colonial rule, in revolutionary movements, and in modern indigenous activism. Collapse resets the scale of power, not the depth of culture. For modern observers, this pattern challenges comforting myths. Civilizations that invest all legitimacy in centralized authority risk total disintegration. Those that embed meaning in local practice, shared memory, and reciprocal obligation endure beyond political failure. It asks whether humans will recognize the pattern early enough to carry something meaningful through it. What returns after collapse is never identical to what fell. In this sense, collapse is not the opposite of civilization. Chapter 10: Mesoamerica, a civilization without an empire. What endurance really means. Empires demand visibility. Endurance does not. When most civilizations imagine survival, they imagine continuity of power flags that still fly, capitals that still rule, institutions that still command obedience. By that measure, Mesoamerica ended 5 centuries ago. Yet, by another, deeper measure, it never collapsed at all. Mesoamerica forces a difficult redefinition of civilization itself. It suggests that civilization is not synonymous with empire, sovereignty, or dominance. It can exist without a center, without expansion, without formal authority, embedded instead in practices, relationships, and ways of interpreting the world. This is endurance without spectacle. After the fall of Aztec and Maya political structures, there was no attempt to rebuild empire. No unified revival movement emerged to reclaim imperial power. This absence is often misread as failure or resignation. In reality, it reflects a different priority. Imperial structures had been the most vulnerable layer of Mesoamerican civilization. They attracted conquest, concentrated violence, and demanded sacrifices, both literal and social, that eventually exhausted legitimacy. When empire collapsed, communities did not rush to replace it. They withdrew meaning downward into households, villages, land, and language. Power became local. Memory became portable. This shift transformed what endurance looked like. Instead of centralized coordination, there was dispersion. Instead of monumental time, there was seasonal time. Instead of cosmic kingship, there was communal obligation. Civilization flattened, but did not thin. Agricultural knowledge survived not through texts, but through repetition. Maize cultivation, crop rotation, and land management continued because they were practiced daily, not archived. Cosmology endured because it was embedded in ritual acts tied to planting, harvest, birth, and death. Meaning lived where abstraction could not reach. Language remained the most powerful vessel of endurance. Indigenous languages carried categories of thought that resisted colonial logic, ways of understanding reciprocity, animacy, and responsibility that European languages struggled to translate. To speak was to remember. This is why endurance without empire often appears invisible to external observers. There are no capitals to conquer, no treaties to sign, no institutions to dismantle. Civilization exists as pattern, not structure. Modern states are uneasy with such civilizations. Nation-states require legibility, borders, registries, uniform laws. Enduring Mesoamerican communities often operate at oblique angles to this logic. Their authority is relational rather than bureaucratic. Their legitimacy comes from continuity rather than codification. As a result, they are frequently dismissed as informal, backward, or incomplete. Yet this very informality is what allows endurance. A civilization without an empire cannot be decisively defeated because there is no singular point of collapse. It adapts by dispersing risk, decentralizing meaning, and embedding identity in everyday practice. This is resilience by design. There is, however, a cost. Endurance without empire often means endurance without protection. Indigenous communities have survived, but they have done so under persistent pressure: economic marginalization, land dispossession, cultural extraction, and political exclusion. Survival has been continuous struggle, not stability. Endurance is not comfort. It is persistence under constraint. This complicates romantic narratives of resilience. Mesoamerica's survival should not be celebrated as proof that domination was harmless. It survived because it had no alternative, not because the conditions were just. The lesson is not that empire is unnecessary. It is that empire is not synonymous with civilization. Modern societies often equate collapse with total loss because they locate meaning in centralized systems: governments, markets, technologies. When those fail, panic follows. Mesoamerica suggests another possibility. Meaning can be distributed. When identity is carried by many small units rather than a single grand structure, collapse changes scale. It becomes survivable, even if painful. The question shifts from how do we preserve everything to what must we carry forward. This question is increasingly urgent. In a world facing ecological stress, political fragmentation, and technological overreach, the fantasy of permanent empire grows fragile. Centralized systems promise efficiency but amplify vulnerability. When they fail catastrophically. Mesoamerica endured precisely because it did not place all meaning in permanence. This is endurance as practice, not possession. It is also endurance without finality. Survival unfolds quietly, generation by generation, without recognition or reward. From the outside, this looks like stagnation. From within, it is continuity. If the answer is nothing, then collapse will be total. If the answer is language, land, memory, and obligation, then civilization may outlive power. Chapter 11. Mesoamerica, Memory Against Erasure. Who controls the story of civilization? Civilizations do not disappear only when they are destroyed. They disappear when their stories are taken from them. For Mesoamerica, erasure did not arrive solely through swords, disease, or conquest. It arrived through narration, through the power to define what counted as history, who counted as civilized, and which memories deserved preservation. Spanish chroniclers framed Mesoamerican civilizations as simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. The pyramids impressed them. The rituals horrified them. This duality justified conquest. Greatness explained the scale of ruins, while brutality explained the necessity of domination. Violence became moral. History was no longer something Mesoamericans told about themselves. It became something told about them by outsiders for external audiences, using foreign categories. Memory lost its author. Indigenous accounts were acceptable only when they fit Christian cosmology or imperial administration. Everything else was dismissed as superstition or myth. The past was edited. Ruins were measured, classified, and dated, while living traditions were treated as degraded survivals rather than legitimate continuities. Stone spoke louder than people. This imbalance raises a fundamental question: who has the authority to define what a civilization was? States answered this question decisively. Modern nation-states claimed ownership of the ancient past. Museums curated artifacts as national treasures. Textbooks incorporated Aztecs and Maya as precursors to modern identity. Tourism transformed sacred sites into economic assets. But this ownership was selective. The state celebrated dead civilizations while marginalizing living indigenous communities. It preserved pyramids while dispossessing people from ancestral lands. Memory was institutionalized, but voice was withheld. The past was frozen. The present was ignored. This is erasure through preservation. Indigenous communities resisted this process, not by rejecting history, but by insisting on alternative forms of memory. Oral tradition, ritual performance, communal land practices, and language became sites of historical authority. Memory was not stored. These forms of memory are often dismissed as subjective or unreliable by modern standards. But this dismissal misunderstands their function. Indigenous memory does not aim to reconstruct events with chronological precision. It aims to preserve relationships between people and land, between ancestors and descendants, between time and obligation. Accuracy is relational, not archival. This difference in memory logic creates constant tension. Legal systems demand written proof. Academies demand citation. States demand standardized narratives. As a result, it is often rendered invisible. Across Mesoamerica, indigenous communities continue to contest dominant histories. They challenge archaeological interpretations, resist commercial exploitation of sacred sites, and assert their right to narrate their own pasts. Memory becomes political, not because it is weaponized, but because it is defended. Control of history determines control of legitimacy. This struggle extends into language. When indigenous languages decline, entire historical frameworks disappear with them. It is losing a way of remembering. Digital technology complicates this dynamic. On one hand, it enables documentation, revitalization, and global visibility. On the other, it risks further extraction, turning memory into content, tradition into data, identity into brand. The question persists: who benefits from preservation? Silence is not accidental. Mesoamerica's experience reveals that civilization is not only built in stone or governed by law. It is built in narrative. Whoever controls the narrative controls how collapse is interpreted, how survival is valued, and how the future is imagined. If collapse is framed as failure, survivors are dismissed. If collapse is framed as transformation, survivors become custodians. They insist that Mesoamerica is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing story whose authors are still alive. They reject the idea that civilization must culminate in empire or modernity to be valid. This resistance is slow, uneven, and often ignored, but it reshapes the boundaries of history. It forces institutions to confront uncomfortable truths, that knowledge is not neutral, that preservation can be violent, and that civilization cannot be fully understood without listening to those who endured its collapse. Memory, in this sense, is not passive recollection. It is an ethical act. The final question is not what Mesoamerica was, it is who is allowed to say so. Civilizations do not survive only by being remembered. They survive by remembering themselves. Chapter 12. Mesoamerica. After the gods fell. What a civilization leaves behind. When the gods fall silent, what remains is not emptiness, it is responsibility. Mesoamerica's civilizations were built on an explicit relationship between humans and the sacred. Gods demanded nourishment. Time demanded ritual. Order demanded sacrifice. When conquest shattered these cosmologies, it did not simply remove belief, removed the framework that explained obligation. What followed was not a clean break, but a long negotiation with absence. The fall of the gods did not end meaning. It forced meaning to relocate. Colonial religion attempted to replace indigenous cosmology with a universal faith, but substitution was never complete. Christianity filled temples, but older logics lingered beneath. Saints absorbed attributes of deities. Ritual calendars blended agricultural cycles with liturgical time. Sacred landscapes refused to become neutral space. The divine was not erased, it was translated. Yet translation came at a cost. When gods are no longer publicly acknowledged, responsibility shifts from the cosmic to the human. The gods are gone. The sacrifices remain. What Mesoamerica leaves behind is not a model to imitate, but a lens to judge. It reveals that civilizations are defined less by what they build than by what they believe must be paid to sustain order. In ancient times, payment was blood. In modern times, it is land, labor, culture, and future generations. This continuity forces an uncomfortable comparison. Mesoamerica also leaves behind a warning about scale. Its civilizations operated within ecological limits they understood intimately. When those limits were breached through overpopulation, deforestation, or drought, collapse followed. There was no technological escape, no external buffer. Today's global civilization faces similar pressures, but on a planetary scale. The difference is not awareness, but denial. Modern societies know their limits. They simply refuse to accept them. The Maya recorded time with extraordinary precision, yet could not outrun environmental constraint. Modern societies record data with equal precision, yet behave as if measurement itself prevents consequence. Mesoamerica teaches that knowledge without restraint accelerates collapse. Another legacy lies in humility toward permanence. Mesoamerican architecture was monumental, but not immortal. Cities were abandoned. Temples were reclaimed by jungle. Stone returned to earth. This was not failure. It was inevitability. Modern civilization struggles with this truth. It builds as if endurance is guaranteed, as if infrastructure can defy entropy indefinitely. When systems fail, shock follows not because failure is new, but because it was never integrated into expectation. Mesoamerica expected endings. This expectation did not produce despair. It produced preparation. Worlds ended before worlds would end again. The task was not to prevent collapse forever, but to carry meaning across thresholds. This is perhaps the civilization's most valuable inheritance. Meaning, in Mesoamerican terms, was not located in institutions. It was located in relationships between humans and land, ancestors and descendants, action and consequence. When institutions fell, relationships could be rebuilt. Modern civilization, by contrast, externalizes meaning into systems. When systems fail, identity collapses with them. The ruins of Mesoamerica are not just archaeological sites. They are reminders that civilization is not a thing to be possessed. It is a practice to be renewed. After the gods fell, humans were left with choice. Choice without cosmic guarantee. Choice without ritual absolution. Choice without promise of permanence. This is a heavy inheritance. Mesoamerica's descendants carry it quietly in language that encodes reciprocity, in land practices that resist exhaustion, in memory that refuses linear simplification. Their survival is not proof of victory. It is proof of continuation under loss. The civilization that remains is not centralized, unified, or triumphant. It is dispersed, adaptive, and unresolved. And that may be the point. Civilizations that believe themselves final become brittle. Civilizations that accept incompletion remain flexible. Mesoamerica never promised an end state. It promised cycles, rise, break, return. What Mesoamerica leaves behind is not an answer to history's direction, but a challenge to its assumptions. It asks whether endurance requires domination, whether progress requires forgetting, and whether collapse must mean extinction. It suggests another possibility, that civilization is less about building forever than about remembering how to begin again. After the gods fell, the world did not end. It became harder, quieter, and more human. That is the legacy Mesoamerica leaves behind, not ruins, not myths, not cautionary tales alone, but a discipline of survival without illusion. In a world approaching its own limits, that discipline may be its most relevant gift, not how to avoid collapse, but how to live after it. Conclusion: Mesoamerica. A civilization that refused to vanish. Mesoamerica did not end at the moment of conquest. It ended slowly, unevenly, across centuries, and, in a more fundamental sense, it never truly ended at all. Empires collapsed, gods were dethroned, stone cities were reclaimed by jungle. Yet the core of the civilization, the way humans understood time, obligation, and the fragility of order persisted, pushed to the margins of official history, but never extinguished. Mesoamerica reveals that civilization is not synonymous with power. It does not require borders, armies, or permanence to endure. While many civilizations are remembered for expansion and domination, Mesoamerica is best understood through survival after ruin. It demonstrates that collapse is not the negation of civilization, but one of its recurring phases. What defines a civilization is not how long it rules, but what remains when rule disappears. What remains here is not glory, but memory, not dominance, but relationship with land, ancestors, and time itself. In the modern world, where global systems grow increasingly fragile and the promise of endless progress begins to fracture, Mesoamerica is no longer a distant past. It becomes an unsettling mirror, reflecting questions contemporary civilization struggles to confront: what happens when growth exceeds limits? Who pays the cost of stability? And when large systems fail, what meaning survives their collapse? Mesoamerica offers no comfort. It offers clarity. It teaches that no order is permanent, no structure immune to time, and no civilization guaranteed endurance. But it also teaches that meaning can be carried forward, fragmented, transformed, and reassembled even after worlds fall apart. This civilization did not leave behind an empire. It left behind a question, and that question still echoes today. Can humanity learn to live with limits, memory, and responsibility before it is forced to learn through collapse? If Mesoamerica has a true legacy, it is not its pyramids, nor its fallen gods. It is the discipline of beginning again without forgetting what was lost. That is not a lesson of the past. It is a warning for the future.